I'm Nancy Ramsay, the director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School, and I want to welcome those of you who have come to be a part of this webinar. The Soul Repair Center provides resources for religious leaders and professional caregivers who support veterans and their families affected by military moral injury. Our mission includes offering free monthly webinars that further that mission with a focus on topics that have been inadequately addressed or not yet addressed. We're grateful for the support of the Shea Center on Moral Injury at Volunteers of America, which co-sponsors these webinars. This webinar will offer resources for understanding the current range of skills and supervisory goals for the formation of military and VA chaplains' identity and competencies in skills for effective practices of spiritual care. Both forms of chaplaincy rely on a CPE model. Our presenters will also help us imagine how supervisors in these two different settings prioritize, shape, and measure a chaplain's readiness in the competencies that are needed for chaplaincy in these two distinct settings. These competencies especially attend to the highly diverse spiritualities that are present on bases and in VA chaplaincy. They also include depth in the area of trauma for persons who have experienced agential or receptive moral injury, whether in conflict or as experiences such as military sexual trauma and racism. Our format will include presentations by both of our leaders, conversation between them, which I will join in the latter part of the initial presentations, and around 3 p.m. Eastern, we will give close attention to the questions that you send to the chat. Trace Haythorn is the Executive Director and CEO of the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education, the standard for spiritual care and education. In addition to his role with ACPE, Trace partners with Wendy Cadge and Michael Skaggs as leaders of the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, an organization committed to research, innovation, and cross-sector engagement of chaplains and spiritual care professionals. Prior to joining ACPE, Trace served as the executive director of the Fraser Center in Atlanta, president of the Fund for Theological Education in Atlanta, professor and program director at Hastings College in Hastings, Nebraska, and associate pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Kimberly Willis is the executive director of the National Chaplain Service within the Outpatient Care Service, of the National Chaplain Service Veterans Health Administration. She is the first African-American woman in the 77-year history of the VA chaplaincy appointed to this leadership role. Prior to this appointment, she served as National Program Manager for Clinical and Professional Development within the NCS. From 2016 to 2021, she served as Chief of Chaplain Service at the Hampton VA Medical Center and also served as an ACPE certified educator. Our chat monitor today is the Reverend Kyle Fauntleroy, a Director of Development at Brite, a founding member of the Center's Advisory Board, and a retired captain in the U.S. Navy Chaplain Corps. He will forward your questions to me to pose to the presenters in the final 30 minutes of our webinar. We deeply appreciate the production expertise of Sam McAllister at Volunteers of America, and you will find a link to this webinar at our website and at the website of VOA in approximately 2 weeks. Please remember that all of our webinars are posted as links on this website and at the VOA YouTube channel. And now let's turn to hearing from Trace Haythorn.
Thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I join you on a chilly day in Atlanta. We kind of believe here that maybe hell froze over because of the Braves' loss in the division series in baseball recently. My goal today is to talk a little bit about the competencies, the learning outcomes that are expected for students as they enter into the CPE process and how that relates to both military service and the work that we do with the VA. We've had relationships with the military and the VA dating all the way back since our founding in 1967. And yet, when most people think about CPE, they think healthcare first and foremost. In some ways, that has everything to do with the ways that these programs are funded and little to do with the learning objectives. Those were the places that could pay for CPE programs. So those are the places we landed. People have forgotten that we initially were primarily in mental health facilities, back when there were still mental health institutions around the country. During the 1970s, when deinstitutionalization took place, the little bit of work we were doing at the military continued at that time, but the mental health programs all flocked very quickly to general healthcare settings. So that's really been the place that has flourished since then. Today, we have programs that are in prisons, that are in centers where folks are getting help and treatment because they've been unhoused, community-based settings, even congregational settings. And part of that is because of the very nature of the language that we've used to talk about CPE for many years. We work closely with our colleagues in Canada, the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care. And one of the things they've been looking at is what kind of language can they use that will be more inclusive of the many traditions that are represented within their association as well as within the larger population. One of the things that they found relatively quickly is the word pastoral is quite difficult for many of the traditions where they serve. They also struggle with the words ministry and with the words theology. Those are fine within a Christian tradition. Many of our Jewish and Muslim colleagues have found ways to make those work well. But as soon as we start talking with our Buddhist and Sikh and humanist colleagues, those words no longer hold. So ACPE is in a significant transition period right now. The language that you'll hear me talk about today still captures a good deal of that historical part. But we recognize that it's problematic and we want to move forward. Our Canadian colleagues no longer talk about clinical pastoral education. They talk about clinical psychospiritual education. Our hope is that we will develop something along a similar line that doesn't lose the historical component and the depth of the kind of reflection that we're asking for, but also is more inclusive and can make room for people that are coming from different traditions as we go forward. When we think about the kind of learning that takes place in CPE, we talk about two different levels. We talk about level 1 and level 2. Level 1 is an entry level. Historically, we talked about that in terms of kind of a personal self-understanding, getting to know who I am and where I come from. We actually talk about that specifically in terms of pastoral formation. So again, that pastoral language that's there. The second area that we spend a significant time around is pastoral competence. So how do you understand the people with whom you work, the social conditions that you're a part of, the systems that you're a part of, the structures that shape all of those things, and how you negotiate them? Those kinds of questions are vital within both a military and a VA context because of the ways that those systems are set up that are very different from what folks outside of those systems would experience. So people in the military who've gone back and forth in and out of service know quite a bit the transitions back to general population as opposed to being within a military construct. The third area that we spend some time working around is pastoral reflection. So really developing ways of understanding one's own strengths and weaknesses in terms of their work. That's really the grounding of the level 1. So level 1 is much of that first unit. So in that first unit, you've got 300 hours of experiential work and 100 hours of didactics, group work, supervision. What we're really trying to do in that first unit is help people gain some of the confidence and competence to do spiritual care well. One of the significant challenges that we face is that a few years ago, the Association of Theological Schools no longer required any courses in pastoral or spiritual care as a part of a Master's of Divinity degree, which is the most common degree that people have as they come into CPE. What that's meant is that CPE educators are now having to provide those very basic foundations of just what does it mean to do good pastoral or spiritual care? That's created some significant challenges as we come into programs because it means you've got to ramp up much more quickly to get people out doing that care on the floors or in the community, wherever they might be serving. It also means that as people come into these programs, we can't make a lot of the assumptions that we used to be able to make about the kinds of knowledge that people have and their ability to serve. The second thing that we've had to look at is then, if that's the case, what are the other kinds of competencies that we need to be paying attention to around kind of critical issues of what it means to do this work well in today's world? How do we help people recognize relational dynamics within a group setting? So for those that have done some CPE, you know that one of the core elements is called interpersonal relations, or IPR. How does a student engage in that IPR in a way that helps their own growth when they haven't had any kind of exposure to such a model prior to coming into the program? The IPR model is also quite a challenge when you work within a military context where command doesn't invite the kind of open expression that the IPR is asking of a sailor, soldier, Marine. How then do you bring that in a way that offers reflection, growth, and depth? The other pieces that are really strong within that first unit is beginning to look at how you serve across diverse populations. So my dream for everyone who completes that first unit is that not only are they gaining understanding and competence around those diversities, but also deepening their own sense of their tradition in such ways that they don't feel threatened or challenged by those other traditions in ways that might impinge upon the kind of care that they're trying to offer. So for example, I'm thinking of a story that came up earlier this summer. Relatively new chaplain, first unit, grew up in a very traditional Baptist context, happened to be in a VA where this was taking place, went in to visit a Muslim patient, and actually had to stop for a minute and look for what was appropriate and inappropriate in this visit. And part of that came out of a story they heard me tell earlier of a man who went in to go visit a Muslim woman, and she immediately expressed how grateful she was that he was there, and he reached out to take her hand. That wouldn't be appropriate, but he thought he was being compassionate. So what are the kinds of things within us that we think are helpful that actually might get in the way because of things we want to pay attention to in terms of diversity? The other piece that we're trying to teach in that first unit is really the clinical method of learning. Action reflection model. How do you go out and do this work on the floor and then bring that back? So we see that most often in verbatims, but also in supervision, and how you use supervision, how you use your peers to grow. Rather than thinking this is just about skill acquisition, it's much more than skill acquisition. That's certainly a part of it, but the deeper part is really coming to understand how and who you are in this space and how you can serve well. The second piece that's really vital in all of this is looking at that pastoral reflection model and being able to receive feedback and hear that that feedback is about formation, not just criticism or critique of who and how you are. So using that clinical model to not just do action reflection individually, but to use the other peers and supervisors who are there to support you along the way. This is all within that first level 1 piece. Now, I can say, kind of a preview, we are currently exploring within ACPE how we can develop this even further to make it clearer for students what the expectations are, but also meet the expectations of the U.S. Department of Education. We serve as an accrediting body for the U.S. Department of Education. We don't run these programs, we accredit them. So much like the Association of Theological Schools is accrediting the seminaries and divinity schools, we have that similar kind of role. So one of the things that we're really trying to sort out now is, what does it mean to do this in a way that reflects what we're learning about student learning, and how we can most effectively help that work within these multiple contexts. So thinking of how is a a level 1 unit going to be different within a military or VA context from what it would be, say, in a pediatric setting? How do we make room for that within the standards that are established for accreditation, while also making sure that we're paying attention to those important pieces? So, for example, we know that moral injury and trauma-informed care have become vital, not just in military context, but across the board. What we'd really love to see is more programs developing second-year residencies that make moral injury and trauma-informed care the centerpiece of their work. We think that's really important within VA settings, but also within the military settings too. There's been some interesting work that we've seen done recently in South Carolina with the South Carolina State Police, where they've been focusing on some of the same issues, which you may think is similar to what's happening within a military context. So part of what our goal is to try to develop these models in ways that can get to these questions of what is effective clinical pastoral education within these contexts, but without tailoring it so much that we can't also accredit across all these different ways of doing this work. We do have some programs that have done this in palliative care. So I think we've got some things that we can model within the palliative care piece for more of the military settings and for the VA settings. But we do have many programs that are already up and running in the VA context. And what I'd love to do is invite my colleague, Kimberly Willis, in to talk about where things are within the VA, what we're looking at as we go forward, and how CPE can be a resource to students as we're thinking about effective chaplaincy within a VA setting. Kimberly, do you want to step in at this point?
Sure. Thank you, Trace. I appreciate that. So I want to apologize to the listening audience for my voice. I have a cold, and I'm trying to make do. I solicit your prayers as I go forward. And Trace, thank you for giving that very in-depth overview of what level 1 CPE looks like and the competencies that are associated with that. When I think about CPE for the Department of Veteran Affairs, CPE is so vitally important that we require 4 units of CPE to even be hired as a chaplain within a VA context. Because I think what happens to a chaplain in the context of that training is so vitally important in the shaping, in the understanding, and even in the broadening of their perspective of what spiritual care is, what it looks like, what it could look like, the potentialities of spiritual care. Trace talked a little bit about moral injury, for instance, as something that the VA is looking at and providing care, training in. He is absolutely correct. It's not just moral injury, it's post-traumatic stress disorder, MST. Many of our trauma type experiences, the VA is really looking to ensure that our chaplains are equipped and able to care for those veterans in which they encounter. So part of the training that happens is all around the trauma-informed care. But there's something that has to happen before you even get to that. And that's the work that we see in level 1. Now, I'm going to use level 1 a little bit differently than how Trace has used it in his context of level 1 and level 2 CPE as it relates to the outcomes and competencies within ACPE. Within the VA context, we also use the words level 1 and level 2. And essentially what that means is level 1 is the first year of paid residency training. Level 2 is the second year of paid resident training. So level 1 is really that chaplain working with learning who they understand themselves to be as a spiritual care provider, what that means within the system, what competencies he comes to bear, such as listening and attending, and how they show up in the room and what they show up in the room with. Looking at group dynamics and how they function within the groups, those roles that manifest themselves, how they play out, the interdynamics of that. So that's really what's happening in that level one. Also in that level one, simply because of this, our context within the VA, we're also looking at suicide prevention type measures. You know, what happens when you get a suicidal patient, homicidal patient, what are those things? So there's some urgent care type things that we also look at in that level one experience, because that chaplain might be encountering those things. However, the level two is where we look into more of a specialty. That's the second year. And that's where we really begin to look at moral injury. What's happening with the patient that's sitting, standing, or even on the phone with us that we're working with? What has that person experienced? And so being able to really distinguish themes, to understand triggers and how those work, to have a keen sense of the behavioral sciences. So what you'll find in a level two experience at the VA is a much deeper integration with our mental health partners, whether that's psychiatrists, social workers, or psychologists, and being an integrated part of that interdisciplinary team. And so the chaplain who comes to a level two experience is sitting on that team and really lending their voice to add to the care plan. Now, I'm not here, while I was a military chaplain, I'm not here to talk about the military so much. I won't speak as an expert in that area, but from the VA perspective, the care team, the interdisciplinary team, if you will, works hopefully pretty seamlessly to develop a plan of care for a patient. So there is transparency and openness about what is happening in those sessions with the chaplain in the VA context. Whereas in the military context, what is said to that chaplain is strictly confidential, and that's a different paradigm. So for our military chaplains coming to the VA, there's some shifting and adjusting that needs to happen along those lines, because in the VA context, it's the whole team working together in transparency to develop that plan of care. So one of the competencies that a chaplain would need to have in our context is developing and fostering those relationships with the team, learning how to work in the context of those teams, and understanding the language that is present in those spaces. In chaplaincy, I really appreciate that Chase lifted this up, because we oftentimes speak out of a Christian perspective in our language, which is not always appropriate considering the context, because we may be with someone who's speaking from a very different religious construct, or even in the medical center. When we're dealing with other folks, they may not be using that same language. So how do we use the language of medicine in the space that we're in? So part of the learning occurs in that language and deciphering and translating, and so that we are all essentially on one accord in the care that we're providing. So it's not just learning the behavioral sciences, but it's also really beginning to explore and utilize promising practices, is what we call them in the VA. But essentially, those are practices that have been vetted, that have been tested, that have been researched, and have proved to be, have some efficacy. One of such programs is Building Spiritual Strength. It's one of our programs that deals specifically with moral injury. And through this 12-week session, we hope that the veteran is able to navigate through that and come to a place of wholeness and wellness in that space. And that program is something that is done most often in joint work with a mental health provider. So teamwork really makes the dream work, to pull on a cliche. One of the other things that's really important is knowing when to refer. Oftentimes it's easy to, if we're in parish ministry or in other contexts, to work in silos, maybe because we're the only ones. But within the context of the VA, of knowing where our roles end and other care provider roles begin, and being able to provide the effective and efficient referrals that are necessary in order for that person to get their care. So essentially knowing how to stay in your lane, if you will. But one of the things that I would say about VA chaplaincy that's probably true in any context is that as a chaplain, we have to do our own work. What do I mean by that? It's great to build some skills, to go to a class and learn how to deal with someone who's working in palliative care, to understand what the grief process is and the different types of theoretical models around grief or trauma care or any of those things. But doing our own work, because we show up wherever we are. And so how does that person who shows up impact the care providing moment? And so doing our own work is whatever spiritual disciplines that we utilize to be serious about those things and to begin to have a concerted practice around that, so we can be clear about how we show up. There's a sense of our own self-awareness and our own ability to communicate effectively and well. That's the kind of self-work that I'm talking about, because I think we miss something very seriously. And this is the wonderful thing about the level 1 CPE process, is that action reflection model really gives you an opportunity to investigate how you are showing up and those areas that you might want to pay more attention to, those areas that in the context of your spiritual disciplines that you're working through. So I think all of those things are extremely important and vital if we're going to be successful in the context of the VA, because we encounter people from every generation of care. I think about how my Vietnam veterans, when they came back, they were not celebrated. They were not high-fived and congratulated. Many of them took off their uniforms as soon as they landed so that they wouldn't encounter some type of hostility. But then we have our Desert Storm, Desert Shield folks. I happen to be one of those persons who were highly celebrated every time we returned from a deployment. So that's a different way of being, experiencing the world, and even showing up in the VA office. So knowing that there are some differences. There's differences in race, there's differences in ethnicities, there's different in religions. And one of the things that I'm so extremely proud of within the VA context is that we're not afraid to bring in subject matter experts. We're not afraid to bring in somebody from the Buddhist temple. We're not afraid to bring in somebody from the mosque or from one of the Native American tribes to come in and to teach us how to be with. I can think most recently, well, maybe not recently, but in a few years past, how we had a Jehovah Witness come in and teach us how to be with. We had the basic training about, blood, how we should deal with blood and those things, but how to deal with the person and what's important as it relates to how they understand their spirituality and their faith construct. It's just very different than reading a PowerPoint or someone reading a PowerPoint to you about what's important about a religion, but actually having someone share what's important to me when you walk into the room as a chaplain. That shifts the paradigm and it enhances the conversation completely. And that is one of the things that I'm completely proud of and excited about within the context of the VA, is that we do bring in these subject matter experts to help not just our students, but even our staff chaplains to get a better grasp of that. We also have internal training that we provide, and it's several different layers of training. We have what I call our core training, which is essentially basic training. And in that space, we work with our newly hired chaplains to help them understand the system. How do you navigate the system within within the VA. It's the largest healthcare system in the world. So how do you navigate this healthcare system? How do you get in there and do your notes and do those things? But how do you also show up in the spiritual care moment? So that's the core. Then we go into what we call the CAVE training, which is specialty training. How do you work with suicide prevention, moral injury, PTSD, palliative and hospice care, those type of things. So we try to provide many avenues beyond the CPE moment or moments, if you will, whether it's level 1 or level 2, to continue to foster this professional development within chaplains. So as you can tell, my voice is trying to escape me. So I'm going to close for the moment, and then if there's any questions, I believe that Trace and I are available to answer those.
Thank you, Kimberly. And right, and we'll ask Trace to join us, Sam, and we'll be set to go. There we are. First, and Kimberly and Trace, you might want to unmute if you're muted. But Kimberly, we know your voice might mute in any case. But thank you I think you're still muted at the moment. First, I want to thank you both for the ways in which you've given us some shared background on the ways in which the training, the clinical pastoral education training is used in preparing military and just as a military chaplains at the outset. And Kimberly, I'm imagining that persons that serve in the VA context may well have had ACPE shaped training as a military chaplain first. Would that be correct?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. All right.
Necessarily at all. So the requirement for the VA is 4 units of CPE. So that training could come from the ACPE context and or ICPT are the two acknowledged types of training that we have. And the VA requires the most amount of CPE for a person to participate.
Right. I was listening to the layers. One of the ways that I think we could serve our listeners well is if we could now, building on the solid base that the two of you together have given us, if we could talk a bit about the ways in which these training programs and then the ongoing work, for example, that you're describing, Kimberly, has developed particular attention to what is the focus of this center, and that has to do with moral injury, whether receptive moral injury from trauma such as military sexual trauma or racism, as an example, or agential moral injury that one might have caused or experienced as causing in a battle context, for example, or some other situation, whether in stateside, so to speak. So I wonder if the two of you could speak a little bit about your awareness of how these programs have responded to our renewed awareness of moral injury, which is an ancient understanding, but we lost it for a time, painfully. How your two organizations or trainings have learned to respond to our awareness of moral injury in military personnel.
Kimberly, you want to start?
I'll let you go ahead.
I think, Trace, you might want to go first and let her voice recover. I wish I could send you some honey or something, Kimberly.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think it is only fair to say most of the CPE programs I know, regardless who the provider is, playing catch up. They are just beginning to try to reintegrate an understanding of this. And honestly, I think the pandemic has been a huge catalyst for this, the dual pandemics of both COVID and racial reckoning. That between those two, an emerging hunger for knowledge and more effective care have come forward, and I think it's now further exacerbated by the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Just looking at trends, and some of this is the way that we're just following conversations within social media and within our own internal media conversations, where people are seeking resources that can help them begin to address and having to get up to speed themselves. Many of the folks who we have as educators have a cursory knowledge of moral injury, but this is not something within which they've been immersed. And really, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, pushed a lot of healthcare providers to have to understand it in a fundamentally different way.
Mhm.
So this is one of those places where the cross-contextual learning is taking place, that I think is only going to benefit us all. But I think we're in a pretty painful moment right now of just coming to terms with what we do and do not know in terms of effective education around moral injury. Appreciate a lot of what we've gained around trauma-informed care. I think the awareness that's beginning to emerge around the role of the nervous system and all of that is huge. And again, I watch a lot of our educators start to talk about it, and it's as if they're trying to cast a fishing line out into the deep waters, but right now the line won't go quite far enough, and it's dropping in still at a place where there is some rich stuff to draw in, but we've got a long way to go.
All right.
I think what I would add to that piece is that I would say when it comes to combat related moral injury, I think within the context of the VA, we've been grappling with it, wrestling with it, building on it, shaping it, and doing that things for a very long time. And I would say that not that we are, that there's not more to learn, because there obviously is, but I think that's a part that we kind of understand well. I think the gap, however, is when we think about moral injury in a larger context. You brought in the idea or the concept of race, moral injury within that context. That's not something that we are entrenched in as it relates to a study and practice of CPE. While there are some CPE centers within the VA that are moving towards that and working towards that, especially since, I would say, since George Floyd forward. We see more of that work, more curiosity around that work, more trying to figure out, what the student is actually showing up with, what is their paradigm that they're bringing to the table in this CPE context, and recognizing that the trauma doesn't necessarily have to be a battlefield. The trauma could be some other space. And so beginning to do the work and the research around that is unfolding as we speak. And so I'm excited about it. I'm curious about what is to come as it relates to that.
I add one more piece to that too. I think the other part is trying to create a culture where a recognition of that is valued rather than discounted. So being able to put a personal struggle out in a context where I noticed a question in the chat that there may be an intention that you're not doing enough, that if you are a soldier, you should be working on body counts, not thinking about moral injury. And so what are the cultural contextual things that are in conflict with each other? I heard this from a physician, just beautifully stated in the pandemic, where wrestling with their own decisions as to who to treat how much with limited resources. And I think in a similar way, the more active engagement with the precision military devices to try to bring about victory, whatever that might mean, has led to a lot of conflicted conversations within units. I had really powerful conversations with some Navy chaplains this summer around how do we prevent suicide within the Navy. One of the big questions was getting upstream of the cultural things that actually lead people to that place of helplessness. What I would love to see, if we could get it, is data that shows any correlation between suicidology and moral injury.
Oh, yeah.
We're not there yet, but I think that would be a fascinating study.
Mhm. We also have, studies that would suggest how moral injury might exacerbate PTSD. That they're not the same, but they can certainly inform each other. And I think I'm joining now. Just I'm also trying to process on the chat, but within the kinds of diversities of sort of moral foundations that persons bring, variously defined, persons are going to experience a sense of violation of those foundations differently, whatever they may be. And it also occurs to me, I'm thinking about your work, Kimberly, that they might not be ready to deal with that in an immediate way, but it may become more present. I'm thinking about Vietnam vets, for example, that may be in VA care. I certainly am aware of even most of our World War II veterans now are deceased, but for some of those persons, coming home as heroes, it wasn't safe to talk much about what they had seen or done and how that stayed with them. But at the point where some of resistance to sharing some of those emotions might lessen in the last decades of life, I would assume that VA chaplains find themselves working with folks who are struggling with memories that are from decades past. Am I correct, Kimberly?
You're absolutely correct. The reality is we never know when we walk into a room or somebody walks into our office what we're going to encounter, and it really doesn't matter what era veteran that they are. The first job and most important job is trying to facilitate a space that is safe and trustworthy.
Right.
We do that with verbal and nonverbal actions within that context. And I think that space of just affirming people and not pushing, but affirming where they are and what they're willing to share lends itself to more deeper conversations. One of the things that I think is really helpful, and I think this is something that the VA does well, is group work. It's in that group work is, the onus is not always on the chaplain. You have these other men, these other women that have gone through similar experiences, and there's more of this sense of a tribe. And in my tribe, I can talk about certain things. In my using Army language, but in my battalion, I can talk about certain things, or in my company, I can talk about certain things. I wouldn't talk about it over there, but I could talk about it in this context. So the group work becomes extremely important because there is this peer-to-peer healing that occurs in that context. It's extremely important, and the chaplain gets to and is privileged to serve as a facilitator in that environment.
Right. I know there are some VA settings where chaplains are involved in facilitating either writing groups or these kinds of conversation groups that you're talking about. And sometimes the creative arts seems to be a safer or useful mechanism for beginning to share. And I'm aware, I remember distinctly when Rita's work and our work at Brite had just begun around moral injury, talking to some Navy chaplains at I think a CPE conference, Trace, and this was a new term, and so I briefly defined it, and all three of the men said that explains my father. So I'm talking about their experience of kind of generationally, how moral injury might not be vocally expressed, but lives within family systems, and in challenging ways, most likely. I don't know whether you want to speak to that generational piece or not, but one of the, is there anything you want to add to that? Because I have another question to pose. Okay.
I'd love to jump in on that, just because I think there are the genetic family systems, but then there's also the family systems of the units where people serve, and officers who have been there for many years who are carrying that same sort of woundedness and act out of that. And it's interesting, it was interesting listening to the chaplains talk about the differences in the kinds of leadership that they experienced based on their observations of which leaders had done their work, to use Kimberly's term, and which leaders were just, every day seemed like all they were trying to do was just push through. If they could just push through, then everything would be okay. And the truth of the matter is, the harder they pushed through, the more damage they did, both to themselves and the people around them.
Right. I'm wondering, Kimberly, about the ways in which in the VA, family systems might be a part of the training, or is that at all woven into it?
Yeah, at different CPE centers across the VA, it's at varying degrees. I'm going to lift up Hampton, and I'm just going to say I have my biases. And for anybody's listening, it doesn't mean that I like Hampton better. I love all of my VA chaplains and all of my centers. But they have what you call a family support program. And in that particular program, it is a program that has an integration of social work and chaplains working together collaboratively to provide spiritual care and counseling to the veteran and their identified loved one. So it helps with communication and those things, but they go through the training where they're either using Gottman, internal family systems. So they go through these various training modalities, the CPE students, and learning how to be with families and walking with them through health. We also have what we call the Warrior to Soulmate program, which is also a very integrated program that really works on communication skills. And how are we conversing with one another, and is the meta narrative really being transmitted in the way that we want it to be transmitted? So those are just some of the things that we're doing in the VA as relates to family systems, because we know that our veterans aren't, while they may isolate, they are not in isolation. They have loved ones around them or community members around them, and then how do they then connect with those community members and or loved ones in their health?
I think another program I hope we will do is related to the ways, in fact, in November, we'll be focusing on ways faith communities in particular can be supportive of veterans and their families. And certainly one of those is related to it has to do with providing safe contexts in which to share and talk. I want to lift up a comment that Rita made in the chat. So I'm just going to read it a bit and then invite some conversation.
Nancy, before you do, can I just say a little bit about faith communities?
Sure, of course.
One of the things that we do is we have what we call the Community Clergy Training Program. The
community what?
Community Clergy Training Program.
Okay.
So in that, I'm so sorry. In that program, our various chaplain services will go out to various places of worship, and I mean that very broadly. And I say that.
Yeah.
And have symposiums or do other such things where they invite community clergy in so that they can do a couple of things. One, teach them certain things as it relates to suicide prevention, moral injury, and other important facts around the care of veterans, because the reality is we know that some of our veterans will never come to the VA, but they will go to their clergy person.
Right.
So trying to give them some tools
Mhm.
that they can use in their care of their parishioners. And again, I'm using this language very broadly.
I understand.
But, and then also helping them to figure out how to refer. And so this way we get what we call warm handoffs. So
Right.
the veteran A goes to their clergy person, whomever that might be, but the clergy person has gone through our training. They know, hey, this is a little bit out of my scope, but I have a warm body, somebody that I know that I've developed a relationship with, that I know is going to take care of my person.
Mhm.
And so then they can have that warm handoff so that we can take care of that person that they're concerned about.
Good.
That's just one of the many programs that we have available.
Mhm. So I think one of the implications that you're raising up, Kimberly, would be for religious leaders, variously defined, to be aware of and be in touch with the closest VA in terms of ways there may be such referral possibilities
Right.
in those locations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to go to Rita's observation, because I think this is really important for veterans and for active duty folk as well. So both the CP training for military chaplains and in the VA. She cites that there was a study done with 900 combat Marines, and overall their PTSD rates were not high. But the group that had the highest rates were those who also experienced betrayal as moral injury, what we would call, what is often called receptive moral injury, where a person that you had in every reason to expect to support you and to act in ethical ways, acted in some way that was not. And I don't know whether, Kimberly, you can, the thing that comes to my mind, obviously could be a person who ordered or put active duty persons at risk in ways that they perceived as problematic. But I'm also thinking about the statistics now that are showing what appear to be high rates of military sexual trauma and sometimes intersecting with racism with persons who've never served overseas, that is on bases now, with higher suicide rates than we had when persons were in battle. So the kind of expertise that's related to receptive moral injury seems to me to be especially important, both with military chaplains and with VA chaplains. I wonder if you can talk a bit about your response to that in terms of the two programs with which you're related.
So when I think about it, it kind of goes back to what I said previously, is that the VA has done a really good job with combat, right? And we've really worked hard with that. I think the places that we're getting better is working with persons who experience MST. And it doesn't matter whether that's stateside or overseas.
Right.
The damage that type of betrayal has on a person is not contingent upon their location.
Right.
It's contingent upon the absolute betrayal of personhood, the creed, the models that one follows or thinks that they have bought into within a military context. So I think what's important, and one of the things that we do, and I want to caveat this just a little bit, because I'm going to talk about the women's clinic, because that's where we do a lot of that work. However, women are not the only ones who've experienced military sexual trauma. The reality
Right.
is
Absolutely.
that a number of men
Right.
who have not identified and probably won't identify, but then they have trauma-related behavior
Mhm.
that we have to be keen to so that we can listen differently
Mhm.
and respond differently when we're receptive to and aware of the type of language that manifests itself in those spaces, so that a person can actually get the type of care that they deserve. Because most on the male side, most of them don't self-identify individually. It comes out in those group contexts
Mhm.
that we've talked about, and then we are able to put in other ways of being with them so that they can manage and navigate that.
Right.
However, in our women's clinic and most of the services that offer very specific services within the women's clinic, there is a MST group, generally speaking, not always and not at every VA, but generally speaking, there's an MST clinic that addresses those issues in a group format and also individually.
Right.
To work with those veterans that have shared that this is something that they're working with.
Mhm. So, trying to protect your voice as it fades. There is awareness about military sexual trauma for men and for women. And it could be dangerous to report it. It could exacerbate or cause more injury. Just for the listeners who may not have been with us for other webinars, we do have previous webinars that address both military sexual trauma for women and the experience of male survivors of military sexual trauma. And I'm aware of recent statistics that suggest that there's a really significant level of this that often leads to folks leaving the military in a preliminary or an early way. In our webinar that we did last spring related to unhoused veterans, a clinician who worked with that population initially with the VOA and then independently indicated that there was a marked coincidence between survivors of military sexual trauma, men and women, and being unhoused. So I think I'm grateful to know that the VA is working as well as it is, or as closely as it is on this issue. I think it is variously attended to in military chaplaincy training from research that I've been doing on that. But I think what Rita was trying to underscore for us is that receptive moral injury, that sense of betrayal, is a marker that has apparently more weight or significance in the consequences for persons. And so that's an important point for us to track.
I completely agree. I think it's important, though, to also note is that a veteran might not just directly say that this is their experience. So recognizing that it does carry weight. What are the images? What are the symbols?
Mhm.
What's the language that this person is using so that we can keenly pick up that there's something more to
Right.
the story, and then facilitate the environment for that to unfold as they are ready to allow that to unfold.
Right. Grace, I'm assuming you'll jump in when you have something to add. Kimberly, one of the webinars we offered last spring had to do with writing groups that seemed to be very helpful for a number of veterans. And it may be a way in which to express emotions or ideas that it might be indirectly expressed, but in the context of the writing group, there is sometimes sharing that is helpful let's say, for navigating challenging feelings, whether it's about moral injury or military sexual trauma or not. There's still challenging memories and things to process, I guess you could say. I wonder if, I think the VA has some writing groups. Am I correct? Could you say more about that?
Yeah, so there not only writing groups,
Mhm.
there are groups that draw.
Mhm. Great.
I remember when I was in the Fort Worth outpatient clinic, I partnered with recreation therapists,
Mhm.
and we had the great pleasure of taking some women out on fishing trips. And prior to, we would go out, and early in the morning, first thing in the morning, we would have a prayer. We would do some fishing, and then we would have a group later in the evening where we just kind of talked about nature
Mhm.
and how that impacted their spirituality. And out of that, it was really amazing to see that people had been closed off, um, limited in their willingness to communicate with others and to be open to others, how being out in open spaces, um, and being intentionally reminded of their spirituality and challenged to connect to it in a deeper way, in a different way, maybe,
Mhm.
how they opened up and blossomed. And we were only there for a couple of days.
Mhm.
But it's all of those things that is really helpful, whether it's drawing, whether it's writing, whether it's getting out in nature. I think all of those types of things that allow a person to bodily experience their spirituality, to bodily experience themselves, not in a trauma state, but in a state that is safe and loving,
Mhm.
uh, provides an opportunity for people to shift. Does that,
Mhm.
does that answer your question?
No, well, there wasn't a correct answer, but I appreciate I think part of what you're suggesting is that there are a variety of ways that groups of veterans can be formed in which there's no direct expectation of sharing, but there are ways of deepening comfort with others and an experience of the environment that is healing in itself, or conducive at least to it.
Yeah, and that's something they can recreate, right,
Mhm.
on their own.
Mhm.
I mean, so we have this opportunity to introduce and present an experience that they can say, huh, this feels different.
Mhm.
Not sure what's happening, but it feels different. And maybe this is something I can practice
Right,
when I'm away from the VA, because that's ultimately what we want people to do as it
right.
relates to healing and healthy living, is to be able to live within community and be fully intact and have the skills and tools that they need to
Mhm.
navigate their life experiences in a way that is life-giving and life-producing.
Mhm.
Can I jump in at this point and
Please.
name two things that are, I think, really important keys that Kimberly's demonstrating? And one is that up until the 1990s, there were some sort of core philosophies for how to do clinical pastoral education formation, so that people had particular theories they were drawing from. And that's really broken down quite a bit. I would say most of the theory that people are using in helping equip chaplains now to address this is pretty eclectic. But the key piece that Kimberly models is the relational piece. So if it's a tool that's going to facilitate relationship, and in this particular context also creates a space of safety where someone can take the risk to put some of those vulnerabilities out there, especially where they're in a context that does not welcome vulnerability and risk.
Mhm.
So those two pieces, I think, are really important to name.
Mhm.
There are other theories that are very prescriptive. We have folks out there, not many within our association, but people that are still offering CPE that spend a lot of time on psychosocial or psychosexual development, drawing on a lot of Freudian theory. And I'm not sure how helpful that is today. I can state even more strongly, I think it tips near malpractice and actually can create some or re-trigger some trauma that people bring into these spaces rather than helping people process it. CPE, for one thing, is not supposed to be group therapy. That's not what that's about. There are other places to take care of your therapeutic needs. At the same time, equipping chaplains to be able to address these issues and know what their resources are pretty vital. I know that there was a question from Elizabeth about an email list that might be available. I think that's Nancy and Rita's world more than it is mine, but looking at what resources, not only that we have, but what are the resources we need to develop? What are the kinds of things out there that people are really hungry for? I think we're all invested in those questions as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do not know of such a list at this time. I've not heard of it. If there is, it could be useful. Kimberly, did you want to respond to what Trace was just sharing?
I don't know if you noticed me nodding my strong affirmation in what you said. I don't think I need to add any more. I think he was spot on with what he said. I don't know of switching slightly, I don't know of any list either, but maybe that's something that could be a COP for ACPE or something. I'm not really sure. But it'd be worth thinking about.
I'm wondering about the ways in which, from your perspective, Kimberly, and Trace, perhaps from your experience, that you're aware of communities, for those that do participate in some form of a faith community, ways that I know I think the VA has, as you were describing, has reached out to some faith leaders. In next month, we're going to try to feature kind of veteran-friendly congregations, faith communities, ways for faith communities to be sensitive to and supportive of veterans and active duty personnel. But I am aware that there are ways to try to acquaint religious leaders, and certainly that's part of what we're also trying to do. And also to lift up the resources of various faith traditions that can be of use, I think. But if I'm tracking with you, Kimberly, one of the things you're lifting up is both experiential opportunities like this, being outdoors, being with others. I also know that writing groups provide some of that, and they are quite effective in various settings. And I don't know whether the VA does writing groups, but it might.
Yes, there are various writing groups. I think about the one that they do at the DC VA. They have a writing group. They also have a musical group that plays music, and they're not the only one. I'm just lifting them up. But
yeah, so these expressive forms, in other words, there's a really strong veterans group, interfaith veterans group in Delaware that also includes photography and nature walks and that sort of. So it's an indirect way, I suppose, but it does facilitate reconnecting with nature, with each other, and processing feelings that may be the way you wish to express them.
I also think it reconnects with nature and with others, but there's what I think it's pivotal oftentimes is the reconnection with self. To be in these spaces, and whether it's via instrument or something drawn or something written, or just experiencing what the wind feels like. Not in a combat situation or not in a hostile situation, whatever that, you determine that, but just to feel the wind on your cheeks and to be completely aware of yourself in that space. I think that's, if I can use a term, that's where the magic happens. And
Yeah.
that's the exciting part.
That's a lot of the neurobiology stuff that we're learning as well.
Absolutely.
And the brain's capacity, the whole nervous system's capacity for resilience. That I think resilience is thrown around way too lightly. Resilience is hard work, but it is being in spaces like what Kimberly is describing that can make such a difference. And it's also one of the beautiful differences is it's equal ground. It's common ground for folks. So it's not within a particular faith community. You're not worrying about diversity of experience. It is an invitation to be in a space where people can encounter one another. And that's that kind of beauty. I mean, we live in the natural world. We just happen to build walls to separate ourselves from it. How might we be more reintegrated and allow that resource to be available to us? I even talk with folks who, particularly during the pandemic, encouraged them that anytime they had a chance to get outside of the buildings where they felt housed in, they just take a 5-minute walk. It's something that simple that can be the beginning of transformation.
Yeah. One of our, well, how shall I say it? One of the participants in this webinar has also lifted up the ways in which, for some, especially as she points out, for some populations, such as military spouses, employment would add to resilience. That is, the relief from the stresses. That prompts me also to talk about my experience in talking with some military chaplains on bases whose work is challenged by practices that hinder persons coming to seek help because it would be shared in their folders and could impede advancement. Indeed, probably would. So referrals are career-wise problematic. And I can imagine the pressure for chaplains in knowing that they're caught in that kind of system. But it does appear that military bases may not be the place where personnel or chaplains can actually be a referral, can help with referrals, or a person receive it without knowing that this could have real consequences. So so there are part of the difficulty, I think, of what we're dealing with is some of the problematic rules that are in place. Neither of you may feel free to talk about that, but that is something that chaplains have shared with me as a real challenge in their work.
I think it's spot on. I think it's also a not yet. And the parallel I would draw is to AA and NA groups that are available on bases now, where before that was anathema. You just couldn't have it. And if someone was participating in something like that, they'd often be slowly but surely discharged. I think we're at a cultural shift point. So one of the important pieces of this webinar is having the conversation and trying to bring it into those contexts, because it's not going to be a flip of the switch. We're probably looking at a decade's worth of work before it's actually integrated into life and culture, and there's an awareness rather than a resistance to it. And to be fair, for those in command, in our house we call them OMDTs. That's one more damn thing. There's already so many pressures on command around budgets and personnel, recruiting, retention. What's coming next? Are we fighting with China? Are we headed back to the Middle East? What's going on with Ukraine and where do we fit? Those kinds of meta level things are always present. And so bringing those together and then trying to pay attention to these dynamics, they begin to feel just utterly overwhelmed. They don't know how to fit that in there. And yet we found ways to integrate so many other things into their awareness So I think we're getting there. I mean, the fact that people were asking me those questions this summer related to suicide, I think there's an attention, especially higher up. There's still a little bit of an attitude. If we can just figure this out, we can fix it. And anytime you get to the fix it mentality, there's bigger issues to deal with there. But it also points to that it is a longer term strategy and not a quick fix kind of experience.
I would say that.
Go ahead.
So when I was in uniform, chaplain's office was the safe space, because that was the one place that was non-report, right? So we would get those folks in, but then the question is when it's outside of our scope, now what to do? And so part of the work that I did while I'm in uniform, and I'm only speaking out of that context, was I developed relationships with other care providers, so that there was resources available that I couldn't provide, that was still in some way safe for that military person. In other cases, it really was just being honest. What's more important, your life or this career, which you're not going to have if you don't have a life? And having those very frank conversations in order to get to a place where we get the care that we need. Because at the end of the day, I want you to live, because if you're living, if you're breathing, if you're here, you have an opportunity for something to be different. But if you're not here, there is no chance. And those are the kind of conversations, tough to have, but very necessary.
You know what that suggests to me, Kimberly, is the pressures that military chaplains, in particular, since that's where some of these constraints are operative and base practices on bases, the pressure that could create for a military chaplain to respond to, if the person had the courage, knowing the constraints, to come share. Then knowing that you're practicing care in a way that was safe for that person. I would think that would be pressure filled. That might be a way to put it.
At times it was.
I think there are two words there too, Nancy, that you use that just underlies so much of this, and that's around safety and trust. I mean, yeah, it is one thing to say you're going to provide a safe space, but how do I know that's trustworthy?
Right.
And that again goes back to questions of betrayal, that so many people have felt betrayed in these systems.
Right.
And these systems have not proven themselves trustworthy, which, as long as you got people involved, there's always going to be kinks, right? I'm enough of an old Calvinist to still think there's some sort of depravity in all of us. At the same time, I think it is a moral obligation of those in leadership to be crafting these kinds of spaces, especially if we want to be able to have an effective military, if we want to be able to have effective healthcare. These are vital, vital questions, not just convenient, trendy topics of the moment.
Yeah, I agree with you completely on that. And it has been a sobering experience for me, to say the least, to have many conversations now, especially with military chaplains, about the pressures under which they work. And the chaplains need chaplains, I guess is one way to put it. Yeah, I want to circle back. This may seem a little abrupt, but there's an area we haven't talked about, Kimberly, related to the VA care, that I wanted to ask you. And that it occurs to me that for some military folk, it may not be, they may be able, let me put it, the resilience to or capacities not to talk about moral injury in their service for decades can diminish, maybe in the in the 70s or the 80s. And I'm thinking about the ways in which then a person begins to talk about moral injury with their adult children or a spouse, if that spouse is still living. And there might have been some sense of distance with this parent before, but I'm wondering, I'm assuming that this sometimes happens in VA settings. And I'm wondering ways in which dementia or theories about aging also inform preparation for VA chaplaincy. For those that I believe there's some VA units, particularly for older veterans. Am I correct?
Yeah. We have what you call community living centers.
Mhm.
And in those spaces, we have our senior veterans, generally speaking, and some of them with varying ranges of cognitive impairment, whatever that might be. And so it is part of the learning process in our CPE program, specifically in those CPE programs that have community living centers, and learning how that shows up. Again, in those spaces, some of those people they are not communicative. So if they're not
Right.
speaking, then how do you navigate that space to even do a spiritual assessment?
Right.
What does that look like? How do you partner with their family members who may be present? But what if
Right.
there's no family member present and it's just that veteran, which is unfortunately often the case?
Yeah, that would be. I'm
Yeah.
also thinking about, I don't know whether the VA has outreach to, I'm thinking about care communities or living contexts for older adults where they, persons may move eventually to assisted living, for example. And there's chaplains at these locations. Does the VA have any programs that reach out to chaplains in those settings where there will inevitably be veterans?
So in the contracted facilities, the answer to that question is yes.
Mhm.
And what I mean by contracted, I mean contracted by the VA.
Right.
Then there's some relationship there, and it's actually the chaplain service typically of that medical center that provides that spiritual care for those veterans.
Right. I know that they do. I just wonder if are there ways for them to access resources from the VA?
It is the VA who's providing
Okay, well,
those
okay.
resources. So
I was actually
The
thinking.
bigger question, Nancy, I think you're poking at is there are a lot of folks that serve as chaplains within those assisted living and
Right,
tri-care kinds of settings who may not have any training. Many of them are volunteers. They can be local clergy. They may actually be a resident living within the setting who becomes the chaplain there.
Yeah, it varies.
Yeah, and usually any kind of training that they might have, they're bringing it. And if they want more, they're going to be seeking it, as opposed to there being a concerted effort on the part of any of the education organizations out there to try to equip those folks for that work.
I do. I know it can be limited. Sorry, go ahead.
Right, I want to shape that though. So if it's a VA contracted facility,
Right.
Care is coming from the VA, but for those facilities that are not connected to, veterans may live there, but those facilities that are not connected to the VA in any way, as Trace said, that if they're getting care at all as it relates to their spiritual health, because that's the other thing, some of them are not.
Right.
However, if those persons are connected to home-based primary care, then they also have opportunities to receive spiritual care.
Right.
And that's one of those little known facts that's possible for them.
Yeah, if they live near a VA and can go, I'm familiar with that. I think Trace and I are talking about the kind of growth of living communities for older adults, and the number of them that have progressive levels of care, and the numbers of them that have veterans now, particularly Vietnam veterans,
Mhm.
in them, that the importance of acquainting these chaplains. Many of them do have a trained clergy person and maybe then volunteers, but it comes up inevitably, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess what I'm saying is even in those spaces, if they reach back to the VA,
Right,
then there are ways for us to connect and facilitate,
Right.
even if it is telehealth,
yeah,
which we are doing in a great degree. But again, if there's cognitive deficits, there's that piece that causes
Right.
concern.
right. I hear that, and I think that in sometimes moral injury might emerge as cognitive capacities for silencing it yield. And that can be particularly challenging for family systems, and for the person, clearly, when that happens. I think we're coming near the end of this time, and I'm a part of the thing that it seems to me from what you all have shared, especially what you've been sharing, Kimberly, is ways in which various faith communities, I mean, variously defined, being mindful of ways they can participate in supporting a veteran and his or her family as experiences of that service or experiences of betrayal in that service emerge or no longer can be kept back, manifest themselves. Sorry for my grammar, that got kind of twisted up, but I do think what we're going to talk about next month for in November, because of Veterans Day, is how do we create or how do we support what are patterns of care in communities of faith, variously defined, that can honor veterans, can recognize the particular needs of veterans, and perhaps the congregation's own involvement in the harms of war in a democracy. Are there last thoughts on your part of a wide-ranging and I think rich conversation that you two have brought for us?
I'll jump in and just say that I think a huge part of this is thinking systemically, and that we've got to be paying attention to the cultural contexts in which we're trying to address both moral injury and support resilience.
Right.
I think the tendency has been to try to do a one-by-one approach, and I think that is helpful. Certainly, there are a number of people who have been really deeply touched by the kinds of spiritual care that's been able to be offered, and yet it's that old thing about we've got to get upstream and do more work at the top of the river because we can't meet all the needs downstream.
Yeah. Kimberly, how about you? Any further thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do.
I do too.
I just think there's a lot of work to do, and we need people willing to do the work. And one of those pieces that is very vitally important is the research piece.
I'm sorry, what?
The research.
Research, yes. Yeah, I agree with you.
That is the area that we have to do more work, because oftentimes the voices at the table is from a perspective that's extremely important, but it's not a spiritual perspective. And so we have to do more research so that we can lend our voice to issues such as suicide prevention. At one point in time, when I was still in uniform, suicide prevention fell under the chaplain's purview. Over time, that no longer was the case.
Yeah.
What happens when we are more at the table, having these conversations, bringing forth this lens with some empirical data?
Right.
I think that's what's really necessary in order to really advance the cause of,
Right.
of whole health and whole life and those pieces.
I appreciate that. I think another theme may be, given what we talked about a bit earlier in terms of experiences of receptive moral injury, is encouraging military chaplaincy training to include helping chaplains respond to that. That's various across the services, but I think we're becoming more aware of, clearly we're becoming more aware of the ways in which the harm of that can last a lifetime. I think what you all have helped to unpack is the complexity of the work of chaplaincy, whether in military context of bases, that is, or in the VA. And I'm grateful that you've shared your expertise with us, and thank you for giving this time for a conversation that was rich for us and will be available for many others if you follow in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.